And Julia has had a spectacular career as, she calls it a conductor, the person who runs some of the major international institutions of science. And in reverse order, she stepped down January of last year as the director of the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, after running it for 8 years. She was the rector of the University of Peace, the United Nations organization. She was the executive director of LEAD, LEAD International, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to develop entrepreneurial talent, in leadership talent in the developing world primarily. And before that, executive director of ICSU, the International Council for Science. These are major jobs, really major jobs. And you don't get the second one from the first unless you do the first one well. So she has been on a roll. But a year ago, she became free of these amazing obligations and challenges, and is spending this year at Yale to write, to think, with a fellowship we ought to try to imitate called the Edward Bass Distinguished Visiting Fellow in Environment. I don't think we have the equivalent. We ought to. When I had supper with Julia last night, she said one of the reasons I move well in international organization is that no country owns me. She has dual citizenship, I believe, of the U.S. and France, born in Hungary, lived all over the world, knows leaders of the scientific community all over the world. She's been putting her thoughts together. I think we're one of the early recipients of her developing wisdom about looking back on her career. So please welcome Julia Marton-Lefevre.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Bon appétit. This is so nice. In France, if you are invited to give a lecture at lunchtime, everybody's starving and they're rushing to want to go out for their 4-course meal. So this is very nice. Congratulations to Chuck for putting together such an amazing lunch. I am actually spending the year at Yale writing my memoirs, mostly hopefully not only about me, but about how decisions are made or not made in these international organizations that are addressing global issues. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. So indeed, I've spent my entire career linking science and environment to policy, or trying to do that. And I was and continue to be driven by the hope that all of the amazing knowledge generated by scientists and environmentalists will actually be heard by policymakers. But not only heard, but understood and followed up by action. I know you are all interested in this, and I think all of this is really even more urgent now than when I began my career many years ago, as obviously the understanding about the challenges facing our Earth system are much more clear. So hopefully scientists and scientists among you are very pleased that finally your messages have been heard. But I think we still need to find out heard to what extent and how is action following. And I think we have quite a bit more work to do in that. So looking back, I do think that we have had some successes in policy influencing, and we've learned some important lessons. And my hope is that those taking over from us, and many of you are in this room, will move faster and more efficiently than it has been the case up to now. So I want to tell you what in my view has worked or has not worked in the past, and then I really look forward to a good discussion. Let me see if I've figured out how to move this. Oh, yes, like this. This might surprise you. It's not about your office, Chuck. He told me that looks like your office. So, on the 1st of November, 1755, exactly at 9:40 a.m., when most of the good people in Lisbon were in church on All Saints' Day, there was a devastating earthquake followed by a huge tsunami, which destroyed the city of Lisbon, and was felt in many continents, including here. So remember that in those days, disasters were commonly accepted as a message from on high that we just have to accept. So this enormous natural disaster, however, is said to have played a very important role in influencing the European Enlightenment, including for philosophical and scientific works, including of course, about seismology. So some of you, if you've ever studied literature, I hope you have, and I've just lost this also, some of you might remember the last words of Voltaire in Candide, written a few years after the Lisbon disaster, and Voltaire actually wrote quite a bit about that, as he finally understands that, as quote-unquote, we must cultivate our own garden, suggesting, therefore, that we must take responsibility for our actions. This, I think, is good advice even today. So I begin with the example of the Enlightenment for two reasons. I hope you don't think I'm going to give you a lecture on the Enlightenment, although I'd love to do that one day. So, two reasons. One is that I hope that you will agree that there was no warning to the good people of Lisbon on the morning of All Saints' Day in 1755 as the earthquake struck. We, on the other hand, I think have had an enormous amount of warning. And this particular time is really important. We haven't had the earthquake yet, but we've had warning. And at the end of 2015, some very important things have happened. If I can see this, so I hope you all know that in September 2015, all of our governments adopted an ambitious set of sustainable development goals. Now, I also sometimes feel cynical about these things that happen in the UN, just a few kilometers up the road. But I think we have no choice but to try to get behind these. So they represent a new commitment to take actions addressing the root causes of poverty, of environmental, health, and educational degradation altogether. And all of this is a part of the so-called post-2015 development agenda, in which these comprehensive and universal goals are supposed to work together. And I think what's very, very important is that they are meant to be universal. So this is no longer we in the developed world, the so-called developed world. I hope you'll find a new way of expressing the way the world is developed. Developing is a bit awkward, I think. We are going to help the developing world, and this is all about them. No, this is all about all of us. So that was one thing that happened. And then, of course, how many of you were in Paris in December? Yes, not so many. Yeah, maybe we should have met there. So, as you know, of course, there was a Paris Agreement. You know all about that. Again, 24 hours after it was supposed to happen, and that seems to be the scenario for all these negotiations, there was a Paris Agreement which was concluded. It's a good thing that the foreign minister of France, a former foreign minister, didn't really look up when he said anybody opposed, because the delegation from Nicaragua was about to oppose something, and then we'd still be discussing. So he said, okay, it's adopted, everybody clapped. Maybe that's the way to do it, I don't know. But just remember that what that agreement says, it states very importantly that this is about all of us. That is a common concern of humankind, and there is an intrinsic relationship between climate change actions, responses, and impacts, and the equitable access to sustainable development and the eradication of poverty. So there is a link, finally, made by these negotiators between what happened in September and what happened in December. So, and the agreement calls for action by all. I think one of the really great things that happened there is that finally, after 21 conferences of the parties, and you might ask, why has it taken so long, and why do we have to have these every year if we're not ready to make agreements? But finally, the discussion about adaptation has a very, very high level commitment. I think it was felt in the early days, if we mention adaptation, we're giving up. But we've got to do mitigation. Adaptation, the thing is going to happen, as you know very well. So, I think with these historic agreements of just a few months ago, we have been reminded of our responsibilities for the future, just like the Enlightenment was reminded finally. You've got to think about this earthquake differently than just a message from God. So I believe that this is great progress, but of course also represents our greatest challenge. So the scientific community working on various problems of science and the environment has done so in various silos. I know it's very, very fashionable to use the word silo. Even in French, they use the English expression, they silo. But they exist, and whether they're universities, research labs, governments, intergovernmental or non-governmental organizations. So while I think all of you know that this siloed approach is not really working, we seem not to be ready to change the design of the pursuit of knowledge and to make the cooperation between disciplines easier. So I won't talk about universities, because hopefully things are working better there, and you know more about it than I do. I've just started going back to university. I've only been at Yale for less than 2 months. But I certainly believe that governments and the intergovernmental system with separate ministries, separate organizations, these are just not talking to each other. And believe me, I've been there. I know I'm not just reading this from books. So, in the United Nations, where I began my international career a long time ago, and I'm very proud of the fact that I had the courage to also leave before I got sucked into it, and I wouldn't be giving a speech here if I had stayed. For example, the S in UNESCO, which is the only organization that was set up in 1946 to look after science, is supposed to cover both the natural and the social sciences, and believe me, there's hardly any contact between those two sectors, which I think is really a mistake. And as the environment is supposed to be handled by the Nairobi-based UN Environment Program, you weren't there, that was set up after the Stockholm Conference. The other UN bodies devoted to various aspects of science and environment and sustainability are basically, and these are all, whether it's health or whether it's meteorology or whether it's human rights or whether it's refugees, we know about that. These are all relevant, and they're just not speaking to each other. So another challenge in this whole siloing business became obvious as a result of the 1992 Rio conference. Now, Rob, you and I were there, I know. Was anybody? Yes, you were there too, so a few of us were there. So there was quite a bit of talk behind the scenes, and I was in ICSU at that point, that these so-called Rio conventions on climate, on biodiversity, and on desertification should really be working together. After all, the issues are absolutely interrelated. But governments preferred to have 3 different conventions. There was a huge amount of competition as to where to put their headquarters, and that had nothing to do with whether they should really be together, at least have lunch together. 2 of them are in Bonn, but quite far away, and they hardly ever used to talk. It's getting a little bit better. I want to also remind you that these 3 Rio conventions are a part of a plethora of the so-called multilateral environmental agreements, and which are, as you know, legally binding agreements between 3 states or more. And there are some 400 to 500 of these agreements. We've done quite a bit of study on that, and nobody can come up with the exact number, but it's at least 400. Again, dividing the issues into smaller pieces, which is not necessarily bad, but if you focus on influencing policy, can you imagine what your elected official what kind of sense would that person make out of this? There is a little bit of good news and I don't know if you know about this, but 3 of the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements, dealing with hazardous waste, that's the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention dealing with hazardous chemicals, and the Stockholm Convention on organic pollutants, finally decided to work together. It seems like it's not rocket science, but it took a huge amount of time. They now have a single secretariat, and their conferences of the parties are meeting next to each other. It was a long and complicated process. I'm sure any of you could have done it faster. So we have been, of course, scientifically concerned about the Earth system for a very long time, and if you look at sustainable development, I think the environmentalists were the first to start being concerned. So if we look at a brief look, and this is, I know I've left names out, but we're really building in the scientific community on the work of giants. And not only individuals, but I want to talk about networks of individuals. The Enlightenment itself really started to say scientists working alone is great, but scientists working together is probably better. So a powerful example of a really good, I think, scientific network is the International Council for Science, ICSU. It has an acronym which reflects the fact that it has members that are academies of sciences and international scientific unions. That was the U, but I changed the name to express what it really is. ICSU was set up in the last part of the 19th century. And it has a wonderful mission, and it was very easy for me to wake up every morning when I was a director to work toward that mission to promote international scientific cooperation for the benefit of humanity. And so together the national members, which are good on national interdisciplinary issues, the International Scientific Union members, which are good on international single discipline issues, when they come together to form interdisciplinary studies, that's what they do through ICSU. And this is very good. So when I was at the helm of ICSU, and I was hired by a British Nobel Prize winner in chemistry who really didn't understand what I had studied in interdisciplinary science policy program, one of the early ones, but somehow I convinced him to hire me, and we did great things together. And it was at that time that we started the World Climate Research Program, the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program, a study of global change, the International Biodiversity Program, Diversitas. I have to say that we should recognize the fact that ICSU already had done the International Geophysical Year in the 1950s, very important both for science and East-West cooperation, the polar years and so on. So that ICSU had a chance to move even further into the policy influencing realm when it was invited to become the principal science advisor to that 1992 Rio conference. And I think this was really the turning point in ICSU's history, and now ICSU with partners is running a program built on that called Future Earth, which is supposed to accelerate our transformation to a sustainable world. So these were the outcomes of the Rio conference, but being invited by the then Secretary General of the Rio conference, Maurice Strong, who certainly was a great friend and a great leader in all of this, passed away just before the Paris COP started. So, so this, when Maurice Strong came to me and said, would ICSU like to be the science advisor, I had to do a little convincing among my scientific friends, but it was really, I think, an important turning point, and it really showed the leadership of Maurice Strong to have the courage to ask for advice outside of the UN bureaucracy and the UN community. And we then looked at Agenda 21 and saw that there was no chapter on science. And so we pushed for Chapter 35 on the role of science in sustainable development, a no-brainer to us, but you can't imagine the arguments that I had in New York, because it wasn't in the original menu, but we did it. So I mentioned Maurice Strong simply to say that all of this depends on individual leadership and courage, and however wonderful an organization's mission is, if it doesn't have the right people in leadership position, and of course we're thinking a lot about that in this election year. So ICSU is now, which I find fascinating by the way, so ICSU is now only beginning to take the social sciences more seriously. There was another NGO called International Social Science Council, also in Paris. ICSU was older, bigger, and frankly, the ICSU scientists thought that they were smarter. But accepting the human dimensions of all these issues was important. And I think if I were there today, I would look for a merger, and I think they're thinking about it. So that's very good. They finally worked together to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's a good first step. So the concerns of the so-called non-state actors, I don't like that negative of the non-state actors, or NGOs, also a negative, about the future of the planet, have begun to take an increasingly important role since that first UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm, and certainly at the Rio conference. Again, really thanks to Maurice Strong, who reached out. He also reached out to the business community, by the way. The World Business Council on Sustainable Development began with Strong's going to some of his friends in the business world. So this was a positive move, although those of you who were in Rio might remember all the time we spent going back and forth about 20 kilometers or 30 miles or so between where the NGOs were and where the governments were negotiating. And that just shows, and that is still the case. And the meetings where the non-state actors are called side events, another part of language. I'm going to come back to language at the end, because another language which is just so degrading. A side event is not important. What's happening is in the government event. So I think that's very important. Then Agenda 21. Okay. Yeah. Then Agenda 21, which was this important outcome of the Rio conference, including the 3 Rio conventions, formalized the participation of these non-state actors into the so-called 9 major groups, which now have a new acronym. We have to figure out how to pronounce that. I don't know, MGOS or something. And I love the other stakeholders. So I'm the one who put in the question mark. I mean, why not men? Sorry. So it's great that it's all about us, but I think it should be everybody. But of course, women should be 50% of the delegation. Why not people over 60, which I'm proud to be now, and I still think I'm useful. Why not fisher people? Probably you shouldn't call it fishermen, I don't know. So anyway, why not universities? So non-governmental organization, that's kind of like side events, all the others. And why not universities? So I think there are some gaps, and I'd love to see some of you working on that. What? Were they? They're not there either? You're right, thank you. I forgot that last time. You're absolutely right. And of course we know what the Pope did. It was amazing what he's managed to do in the so-called faith-based community. You're absolutely right. Where are they? They must be in that non-governmental. All right, something to work on. And you can tell me if there are others. So, I think we should take pride in the fact that, and I'm not going to give you a test on these, but I could get 100%, and I could put another 100 up there. I'm totally against acronyms, by the way, just because we know them doesn't mean the others are. So I think, although we should take pride in the many accomplishments of the civil society NGO movement, we rarely address the fact that perhaps we could tackle the challenges better with fewer of these organizations, or a little bit less competition, or a little bit more collaboration. This is something that's sort of politically incorrect to address. But I think we really need to think about it. It's a great development. But believe me, these are organizations going after the same amount, the same sources for funding, the same space in the sun. There's an awful lot of competition. And of course, the UN system itself is designed to encourage separation because negotiations happen just with governmental organizations. Some governments include the non-state actors, civil society, in their preparation when they go to a negotiation. But frankly, I'm not sure that they do, and there is no system which forces them to do it on a regular or required basis. Prove to me, government of X, that you are coming here having listened to your civil society, for example. So I'm working with a group of Yale students to address solutions to the design of the UN system, and we're beginning to imagine a multi-stakeholder representation inside of the UN instead of in not only side events. So in the last 25 years, of course, and I think you know all this, so I'll just do it very, very quickly, but as you know, there have been very serious efforts to influence policy through science. Of course, the IPCC set up in 1988, ICSU had a big role in this, and there is no question now that most of us understand the climate challenge and that it is human-made. Some people are saying maybe after 5 assessment reports there isn't a need for another one, and I'd be interested to hear your messages. So we think, of course, where you all are, where I am, I think everybody understands this, but I'm not sure if the presidential candidates, for example, are fully on board on the issues communicated by the IPCC on climate change, but you can tell me that better. I won't even hear for a little while. So then there was a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which worked from 2000 to 2005, brought together about 1,200 of the world's leading biologists, and they looked at ecosystems. It's after that work that we're starting to understand the services that ecosystems bring us, ecosystem services, which I think is not an expression that's understood by the person on the street either. And they closed in 2005, and many of us have something like 12 reports on our shelves. I always felt that it was a mistake to finish with a science assessment and not make sure that something concrete was going to happen. Now, some of you may think that the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that's a really awkward name, which is a sort of IPCC-type mechanism for biodiversity, which finally, after many years of arguments and negotiations and different acronyms, has come to life in 2012, so about 7 years after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment closed. Let's hope that this will start bringing results. Perhaps you have seen the latest IPBES reports on the dangers faced by pollinator species, which threaten livelihoods and food security, and hopefully there will be some answer to that immediately. The French are still arguing whether it should be 2017 or 2018. I think it should be yesterday, but the system doesn't work so fast. In 2010, I attended the conference of the parties of the Convention on Biodiversity, which luckily only meets every 2 years. Climate Convention, why they decided every 1 year when there were many, many of these COPs which cost a lot of money and didn't come up with anything. So late into the night, negotiations it's always the case. It's a mystery to me. Finally, the members of the CBD, and I guess you know that the United States is not a member, although the US always has a big delegation, but they can't vote. They finally came up with the so-called Aichi targets that by 2020, very, very ambitious targets. The first one is by 2020, everybody in the world is going to understand the importance of biodiversity. I think they should at least talk about nature because biodiversity is going to be difficult to understand for people, but that's a big objective. Another one, just to give you an example, is on which we work very much, is that by 2020, the terrestrial and marine domains of protected areas will be very significantly increased. And people are working on that. I'm not even sure why we needed a conference of the parties. The thing that I think it's, well, and then as, of course you know that we finally also, the government also, after many years of negotiations, accepted the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable share of their benefits arising from their utilization. So that was very important, the Nagoya Protocol. So frankly, I have often wondered what happens when tired government delegates go home after negotiating biodiversity, climate, or desertification, or development goals. Do they speak with their colleagues in other ministries? I haven't had too much evidence of that, frankly. Do they speak with their so-called non-state actors? And do the NGOs, when they go home, go get together and talk? I mean, I don't know whether you organized a meeting in the Princeton community after you came back from Paris, just to share. I'm sure you did, or you will. But I think that's extremely, that's a responsibility. So I think that's very important. I have to say that when we were working on the SDGs, there was no mention at all of the Nagoya Protocol, where 192 countries agreed on these goals. Why do we have to start all over again? And it is not mentioned in the SDGs at all. So, as Rob said, I recently stepped down from the position of Director General of IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, established with a very brave design of having NGOs and government members, and there are 1,300 of these. Government members include the State Department of the United States, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. NGOs are big and small, international and local. WWF, all the WWFs are members. Probably very few people know that it was IUCN that invented WWF to raise funds for IUCN. Then it decided to go on its own, but they're all members of IUCN. So it's a wonderful design. And of course, IUCN was set up in 1948. It would have been even more amazing had the founding fathers, and they were all men in those days, would have added business as a third category of membership. Many people used to say behind my back, and I always could hear behind my back, that I held the most complicated position in the international world because of this hybrid nature. Yes, it was complicated, the issues are complicated, and I'm still alive. And I did it longer than any of my numerous male predecessors, so that's good. And of course, the mission of IUCN explicitly in 1948 refers to influencing policy about decisions about natural resources and the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources. The word sustainable was already in there in 1948. So I hope some of you know about the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which is now in its 52nd year, and it has been monitoring the state of biodiversity through this Red List of Threatened Species for the last 52 years. More than 9,000 volunteer scientists, I'm sure there are some from Princeton, are working on their favorite species. So the latest estimate of the total number of species on our planet, I think, is 8.7 million. Of these, about 1.9 million have been formally named, and the IUCN Red List last year looked at 70, really it's a little bit more than 78,000 species, which is a little more than only 3%. But this is already giving us a good idea of what's going on. So the sample looked at by the red list indicates how life on Earth is faring, how little is known, and how urgent it is to do more to preserve the amazing diversity of species around us. Now I have to say that because I'm not a species specialist, I said to the red list people, you've got to explain this a little bit better. We even had a logo designed for them so that you have to explain, because most people say, so what? So we started to, when I was giving speeches to people who were also not species specialists, and believe me, if any minister that I spoke with, our head of a corporation, needed to know the world specialist on a certain kind of butterfly, I would have said very, very honestly, I'm sorry, I don't know, but give me 2 seconds and I'll call you the person. I never had that question, but I was always hoping. So in a way, the decision to have IUCN led by a generalist and a policy person, I think worked. But I used to compare the findings of the red list about our own physical well-being. You go to a doctor, and if you find out that 25% of your fingers and toes are going to fall off, 25% of the mammals of the world, which are our closest relatives, are in danger, serious danger according to the red list, you would do something about it. So we need to really still make more progress there, but we are getting there to convince people why this is important. But it really is a great work, and the fact that it's done by volunteer scientists is really wonderful. So if you can come up with helping the red list people influence policy more directly, and it's not so easy. The 9,000 scientists are working on their favorite species in a favorite place, but the big picture is not good at all. So I think perhaps one of the biggest problems has been, again, the disconnect between the natural and the social scientists. At IUCN we claimed that we respected both equally, but I'm not sure that was true. So, and I think specifically the links to the economic community has been very, very weak. So in 2006, of course, we received very strong messages from the Stern report, the review of economics and climate change. And then in 2008, and that was IUCN's idea, let's do a Stern review on biodiversity in ecosystems. And so we also had a rather awkward acronym, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the TEEV study, which for a while we called the Stern study. And I actually called Nicholas Stern to ask him if he would chair it, and he said, it's a great idea, but it's way too complicated because indeed biodiversity is not only global but local. But we did find a very good person, Pavan Sukhdev from Deutsche Bank, who has been heading the TEEV study, and it has really brought us some very, very good examples. Basically, the objective is making nature's values visible. And I think TEEV continues to help us understand the value of nature and what it would cost to lose nature, which cannot be. So here are just some examples. I think you know that finally we're talking very aggressively about restoration. That's a positive move. It is estimated by IUCN and the World Resources Institute that there are about 2 billion hectares of degraded land around the world, and you can either say, oh my gosh, it's degraded, we can't do anything, or there are methods of restoring. And then what we have done is there's a bond challenge to restore 150 million. There are several groups working on it. That it wouldn't only be nice, but it would bring livelihood benefits, $84 billion a year for those communities that are just eking out an existence. And also carbon benefits too. Of course, we need to price carbon. I'm sure you are all working on that. The argument about the healthy coral reefs bringing benefits both in coastal protection and in tourism really worked with the former government of Australia. I was still there at the end of 2014. They were doing some pretty awful things to the World Heritage Site of the Great Barrier Reef. And when we put the money part to them, then they started to say, you know, maybe you're right, and they stopped doing all those terrible things, and then the government changed anyway. But I think that there are many people who say, how dare you put dollars and cents on nature? It has a spiritual value, which is true. And nobody's really evaluating what it feels like to walk on a clean beach or go swimming in a clean lake like I used to in Lac Léman, the Lake of Geneva, every year. But these arguments help with the system that we have. So I guess the problem is that at the moment the benefits provided by nature largely go unnoticed. They do not appear on the balance sheets of companies, national GDP statistics, but at least the fact that they're now part of the conversation is, I think, a good thing. So we have also heard an increasing number of calls to rethink our definition of the GDP, and I think you know all that, but again, it's very, very important that the conversation is happening. I think now we have to go beyond conversation to really do something. And so these are some of our friends who said things about it, but there are plenty of others, and it's the kind of thing that you do hear about. So hopefully there are some economists among you. Sai, I think that was one of the reasons why we decided to give the Tyler Prize this year. You got it 2 years ago, to Partha Dasgupta, who's really looking at both economic well-being, human well-being, and the well-being of the planet. So I think, and that was the first time that we are going to give the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement to an economist. So I think it's saying something. I'm very proud that I've had some contribution to that. Science policy, influencing, we have to do it. So, you know, lots of people are talking about, I mean, I think I got turned on to the environmental issues when I read Limits to Growth, but there are other ways of growing. And I think what's really important, and I think it's the most important thing, to convince people in this country, I think, that growth in a different way is not going to be uncomfortable or undignified or terrible. We're not going back. Could even be a lot of fun, actually, a new challenge. And I think, just like those people in the Enlightenment, maybe we need that. So, what works and what does not? I think you picked up my messages. But there have been countless recommendations from the OECD and the United Nations to integrate economic, social, and environmental objectives. And yet, our societies seem just stubbornly attached to an organization that separates these things. So this, we know doesn't work, but you have to start moving on changing that. Now, I think universities can, and I know some universities do, especially I think something like this program. I'm so proud of my son having gotten his PhD there. It took some time for his professor to find out that he knew his mother before, but Nicholas didn't come here because of that, but he's trying to influence policy. So universities should take a leadership role in this, I think, and break the disciplines. But there are plenty of universities around the world, and I spend a lot of time in universities that just don't get it. So that's one of the few problems. Of course, very few governments have incorporated sustainable development in a meaningful way. Many of them in a rather cynical way set up an Ministry of Environment. It's usually the last thought, it's usually the junior minister. And there are a couple of examples where at least environment and sustainable development are together in Colombia and France and Tunisia, in Malta and Mauritius, but very few. Norway used to have it, they split it. So I think we need to move faster on that. In my view, frankly, I don't even think we should have an environment ministry. I think those issues should be in every ministry. China, in the year of the Rio conference, set up a very interesting thing called the China Council for International Cooperation and Environmental Development, CCIED. I was on it from the beginning, and then I came back and I was Director General of IUCN. This is a very, very brave design. Obviously came from the top. It's a country which can do that. And said every single ministry that has anything to do with sustainability has got to go to these meetings, and then they invited about 20 foreigners. And we spoke together, and I know that those ministries hadn't spoken together before, but they were told to do so, and they did. And we ended up, after each session of the China Council, giving a report to the president or the premier. And every single one of those, and I met a few by now, was really a technocrat. They understood us. It was very impressive indeed. And then the next year we had to go back and see where did our recommendations go. It wasn't just, one report picking up dust somewhere. Very impressive indeed, and I think should be copied. We tried to set it up in India, not possible. We talked about that a little bit. And of course, this is one of my bees in my bonnet, but the UN system, established in a totally different world 70 years ago, needs a serious redesign. I think everybody knows that. There's way too little communication, a great deal of competition, duplication, and of course bureaucracy, which is really overwhelming the system. And science, of course, environment and development are treated differently. And science itself is just one part of UNESCO anyway. So I was very glad to participate last year in the Oxford Commission for Future Generations, which in its 2014 report, and I recommend you to look at it, it has a good title, Now for the Long Term, called for incorporating sunset clauses into publicly funded international institutions to ensure regular review of accomplishments and mandates. Very elegantly put. We weren't calling for a revolution, but let's at least ask the question. And a sunset clause is a nice way of doing that. And then another thing that I feel strongly about, but I think you've heard it already, is our ability to communicate scientific ideas to non-scientific audiences has also, I believe, been an impediment to progress. When scientists attempt to influence policy, they have often done so, and I've been there, I speak from experience, in their own lengthy, technical, and frankly, often difficult to understand language. I know that policymakers quite often don't dare to say, well, what exactly do you mean? Because that will make them, they think that will make them look stupid. I never had that problem, so I often ask. And sometimes the scientists couldn't really explain very well. So I think this is very important. And I would suggest to those of you in any of these disciplines, whether it's natural or social sciences, to strive at least to become bilingual. That is, to be able to speak your own scientific language with which you can publish your articles and get tenure one day if that's what you want. And also make sure that you're able to explain the same thing to somebody from another discipline or another field. I should say also, if you only speak one language, in other words, English, learn another language too. I think that's also very important. But bilingual here, I mean the scientific and the simpler way. I think that's very, very... And then I also think we need to be a little bit less downbeat. The language of gloom and doom of the environmental community really turned everybody off, frankly. Turned me off when I got to IUCN, and I really pushed them to change. That's enough. Nobody really wants to hear how bad things are. I think we all know it, but what are the solutions? So I'm very proud of having encouraged IUCN to change the language, and IUCN is now talking about nature-based solutions, and nature actually offers solutions, not only for tree huggers or bird watchers, but also for food security, for climate, for development, and so on. So remember that the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, that's what I started with. Remember about it. Now, people just didn't know what to expect, didn't know anything. But many of us know that we may be moving toward a new type of metaphorical earthquake, a disaster of globally intolerable impacts. We all know that. And we now have the possibility to react either by shrugging our shoulders, staying in bed all day maybe, or accepting our responsibilities to drive transformational change in a way we think, we act, and we live. So I think the scene for this transformational change has been set for us. And I think now if we don't take the responsibilities, and I really am looking at those of you who are still students here, the world desperately needs leadership, from not only from the United States, from every single country. So I think it's very important for you to do something. I don't know. This was the first Earth Day, and that was Pogo. And he said, he's right, the enemy is us. It's about us. But if it's about us, we can also find solutions. So I would like to end, luckily I was born with a glass half full, I think, and which is kind of a miracle because I had a rough childhood in communist Hungary, but that will be in my book. But I still see the glass half full, and there is hope. And I think we've got all the messages. I'm not saying more science shouldn't continue, but we've got to bring about the changes. Thank you very much for your
Question period is open.
questions or suggestions.
Hi, Brooke. Can you stand up when you talk?
Sure.
You might introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Helene Golden, and I'm a first year in the Master's in Public Affairs here. This summer, I worked on. I was at the U.S. mission to the UN helped cover the final round of negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals. One thing I noticed was that, particularly for a lot of NGOs, their involvement happened late in the game, and by the final rounds of negotiations, major decisions had already been made, and particularly when they adopt the different resolutions, decisions have already been made. But I feel like a lot of NGOs don't have the mentality of 2 years out we need to be working on these processes. The other thing that I wanted to suggest, which I don't know if you worked with, was the Global Sustainable Development Report.
Yes.
That seemed to me to be the mechanism that they're using to work on the science policy interface. And I remember when I went to a main event, not a side event, that addressed the report. One of the big contributions it was hoping to make was having the resources of NGOs as well as researchers, that countries could use throughout the implementation process, and also to seek further resources for that science policy implementation. I was just wondering if you had any involvement with that particular report?
Yes, we did. Well, of course, IUCN wasn't really an NGO because we had government.
Oh, yeah.
But still, we did. But I think you point to a very, very real example of the disconnect between NGOs and the negotiations. And NGOs often, I didn't mention the word money, but that's a big, and I should have I realized as I was going through this that, I mean, it's money for NGOs and money for governments to actually implement all these things, and that is still one of the big question marks after Paris. But I do think that the NGOs, I really meant that when I put up all those acronyms. It's great that all of this enthusiasm has come about, but now they have to, I think they should try to come together. They would be stronger. Some of those are really tiny, the ones that are complaining around New York. And they should come together and be more organized about looking ahead. We knew about the Sustainable Development Goals for years. So it's a question of organization. They were trying to survive by making sure they have project money for next year, but they don't. So money and organization, and then just a complete redesign.
There, and then 1 and 2.
Hi, I'm Matt Burgess. I'm a visiting postdoc from Santa Barbara. So I had a question about your suggestion to have the sunset clauses and reorganizing these organizations. And I think philosophically you're right. My concern would be that the only thing slower than a bureaucratic organization is a bureaucratic organization waiting to restructure before it can do the bureaucracy. And so I was wondering, how would we know when it's sort of so bad that it's worth it?
Yeah.
And in the spirit of crossing disciplines, I wonder if there's an engineering solution to this. So in that engineers think all the time about how often they need to repair their machines.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same. It's kind of the same principle. Yeah. So I wonder what your thoughts are on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we need to talk a lot more. I think at least accepting that and doing it politely, because these diplomats really do want to keep those jobs. Unfortunately, in Paris, in Rome, in Geneva, in New York, it's pretty comfortable. So we have to do it very nicely and bring them into the discussion. It's going to be tough. I'm running this kind of scenario workshop at Yale with these students who are interested. Many of them had been interns at the UN, by the way, working on the things that you worked on. And we're going to try to do, what if we could just start all over again? What would it look like? And that's not going to happen, but it'll be interesting to see. And what can we do given the system that's in place, including the egos that are involved and the desire for per diems and all that kind of stuff is in there. It's tough, but I think the idea of engineering, if you're an engineer, come and join us.
Unfortunately not.
The question over the desk.
Yeah.
I'm Wayne Pan. I'm a staff PhD here. So you asked a question about after the negotiation, what would the participant and each country do next?
Yes.
So, and then you also mentioned the differences between, for example, India and China in terms of how much they can do domestically. So I wonder, as an international organization, do you think there is a role we can play, you can play, or the organization can play in order to make things move faster in different countries domestically?
I think, yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, things happen in China because you've got a government that can say this is what's going to happen, and it happens. And, you know, that's another thing that lots of people are talking about, not only the GDP, but is democracy the best, the way we know it is the best formula for, and I'm certainly not calling to go back to the world in which I was born, in a very unpleasant country in those days. So, well, these are really good questions. I don't know. I think that China Council was very courageous of China to do. Those ministers really hardly knew each other. And they certainly didn't know us, but we became a team there.
Is it still going on?
It's still going on. Unfortunately, I would say it's still not quite the same. There was a design problem there. I was there from the very beginning. I was the only woman in those days, and so much younger than anybody else. But somehow the design, it's ridiculous. Here's an engineering design, I think. We all had dinners together. And you know, in China, nothing happens by accident. You get your dinner table in a number. And pretty soon I moved up to table 1, which was great. That meant that China also wasn't sexist apparently, nor ageist. I was very young. But when we sat together, we got to know each other, even though there were a couple of interpreters. Xu Ping didn't speak English, but he was a great man. And we got to know each other, and every dinner was together. Now when I went back as IUCN Director General with a 10 years off, there were no longer these dinners. People were standing up. Stupid design. I talked to them. Chinese were here and the foreigners were there. So it was a totally different design. And I got some kind of honorary something from them. And when I got it, all these famous older, like Song Jian and Xu Ping, they all gave me a big hug. And the newer members of the China Council said, "How did you know them?" Well, we just sat for dinner. Design. I think that's really important.
I just wanted to comment on.
Who are you?
I'm Janice Hall, and
You should stand up.
That's okay.
anyway, I just wanted to comment about the disparity between the NGOs and the government and how they've been separated. My experience at Rio really.
This was the first Rio, 92.
Yes, in '92. Yes. When the heads of state were all to meet at Rio Central, and there was no representation from the NGO community, and
because they were all at the
at
in town.
yeah, at the global forum where we had a 5-day event. But the big issue, they created a very big scene, and I think this is the first time this really happened.
Yeah.
And they demanded a seat at the table, and it really threw everybody for a loop, if I remember. And finally, they were given one seat to represent all the NGOs in the entire world.
Yeah.
And they all voted on Wangari Maathai, who had just won the Nobel Prize and just had gotten out of jail from Kenya. And she ended up speaking at our event. But the fact that only one NGO representative is at the table with the global world governments, that's something that really needs to change. And I think even in Paris, there were more NGOs were listened to, but they don't really have an official seat.
So this is why I suggested that I think if we're going to, unless we sunset clause the whole system, I think we should have a way where regularly governments have to prove before they can get their accreditation that they have included in their delegation different parts of these
the NGOs are in the trenches, they're actually out there.
Yes. And some of them do. And of course, now business has a bigger role in these meetings, but they meet in beautiful lunches in different places around. And I went to a lot of these things at Rio Plus 20, and there you could really see that the government system wasn't working well. There were very exciting things going on in the so-called side events. But again, scientists, leaders, separate. Big engineering problem.
Any other questions?
I hope you're going to change things.
Yeah, in some of the last things she did, Eleanor Ostrom talked a lot about what she called polycentricity.
Yes.
And the need to do smaller agreements as building works. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and whether that's actually going on.
Yeah, unfortunately she left us before.
She did?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think so. I know some people that I used to think but not enough. It's about leadership, and you know what? About leadership that we need to make sure that when we've got leaders like Eleanor Ostrom, and I'm not sure whether this is fair to say, I don't know, but that there's already a community around. So if a person changes jobs or
Yeah.
gets ill or something, that the ideas continue. Little bit Bangali Matai's issue too.
Yeah, I mean, she did have a community around and people followed those, but they don't, none of them has
Yeah.
the influence that she had.
Yeah. Leadership is a big issue. Everybody knows it.
On that note, let's thank our speaker.
Is that all right? Yeah.